Okay, he says in Romans 1, as we continue on in verse number 20, he says, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So we talked about that. God has shown himself to be mighty in this creation. People look up, even people in the jungle, people in the far reaches that are out of the main society, and they look and say, someone put this here. And how does he end the verse? He says, so they are without excuse. If they die without seeking after him, it is on their head, and they are judged, and they would in turn go to hell because they do not have salvation. And then he goes on, he says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, and they were not thankful. He goes on all these verses, and I'm going to kind of suppress these verses together. And what he's saying is that at one time, this society, while they worship God, through the generations, they started walking away from God. They started believing that they were wise in their own eyes, that they were able to live without his power and without his influence in their society. And here they are, generations later, they are completely without God and the gospel whatsoever. The perfect example we use is, what about the jungles of Africa? And what people don't understand is, at the time of Paul, Africa and the world was evangelized. Africa had very profitable ports where they did trading and buying and selling. And all that area there in the Middle East were inhabited by society, and it was a place the entire world had heard about Christ. They were only decades removed from Christ walking the earth and dying for our sins. And then he goes on and he says that for this reason, in verse 26, he gave them over to vile passions. Even the women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of women, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And here he's talking about the degradation. They stepped away from God. They made graven images, and then they started walking away from the natural use of the opposite sex. And now we have homosexuality. And he's saying here that this is ungodly, that it was sin, and they did it because they chose to walk away from God. Next week, we're going to talk about the sins that come along with stepping away from God. But keep in mind that we have to realize all of us are in sin, and all of us are fighting every day to try and walk away from these passions and these lusts that we struggle with. Because if we don't, God might turn us over to those lusts, and then our family suffers because of what we choose to do without God.